Do you all ever have weird dreams? I'm going to share with you the dream I had last night. And it is one of the weirdest dreams that I have ever had in my life. But it does tie into our lesson this morning. Last night I dreamed that Vicki and I bought an elephant and 2 lions. They were delivered to us frozen. And we were thawing them out. The elephant thawed out and was alive. 1 lion thawed out and the other had not yet thawed out. And the first lion that thawed out began to eat the second lion. And the last thing that I remember in my dream was how was I going to deal with this elephant at this point that was trying to tear down our front door. And this lion, what was I going to do with them? And the last thing that I remember was I was going through the house, closing all the windows, closing all the doors to try to keep this lion out. I don't have a clue where that dream came from. But you know, you get to thinking about it, we all have struggles in life. We all have giants in our life that we have to deal with. It may be fighting a lion, it may be fighting an elephant, or it may be fighting some disease, or some health issue, or some financial issue, or some struggle that we have in our life. And every one of us, I don't care who you are, has some kind of difficulty that you're trying to face that almost seems insurmountable. 1 Peter 5:8 says that the devil walks around as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And he can be a giant in our life. He can be something that causes us to fall away from God. He's striving to pull us away from God. He's constantly laying temptation in front of us. He's constantly laying the opportunity to sin in front of us. He's constantly putting obstacles in front of us to try to trip us up, but yet we can overcome him. We have the ability to be successful and to be victorious over Satan. We can defeat him. In Romans 8:31, we're told that if God is for us, who can be against us? So we have that assurance. We have that confidence. And in talking about slaying giants in our life, we think about David and Goliath. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, we have the account of David and Goliath. And I know you know that well, but I'm just going to breeze through it kind of quickly for those that may not know. David's 3 older brothers had gone off with Saul to face the Philistines, and David was staying home tending to the sheep. David's father sends him to check on his brothers. And when David gets there, Goliath, this giant, who was over 9 feet tall, was coming out for 40 days and yelling at the Israelites, "You send out your best man and we'll battle. He and I will battle. And whoever is victorious, whoever wins, the other will serve the one that wins." And David gets there and he hears Goliath come out. And David is amazed that no one of God's army has said, "I'll take him on." No one. They were afraid of him. And David says, "I will." And David goes out and faces Goliath. As David is approaching Goliath, Goliath makes fun of David. "Oh, you know, you're just a young kid, you know. And I'm sure Goliath was thinking, hey, this is going to be no problem. But David says, today God will deliver you into my hand. And you recall that David picked up those 5 smooth stones. And he put that first one in the sling. And that stone struck Goliath in the forehead. And down he went. And then David removed his head. David was victorious. David slew that giant because of God's help. Now, what lessons can you and I get from that to help us to face the difficulties that you and I face in our life today? If you don't have difficulties in your life, then I'm surprised. I'm glad for you. But how can we use this account? And I want you to understand something too. This is not just a Bible story. This is something that actually happened. So many times we call these things Bible stories, but I would prefer to call them a historical account that God has provided for us. It's something that happened. But what can you and I learn from this, from David's actions, to help us in our daily life? Well, let's look at a few things that you and I can glean from this account that will help us in our life. Number one, David was shocked that no one of the Israelite army would take on Goliath. Remember what David said? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine who defies the army of the Most High God? David was shocked. You know, he was saying, folks, we are God's army. God is on our side. Why aren't you just going out there and taking him, defeating him? God is with us. David was offended, to use a term that's used a lot today, because they did not trust God enough. Even Saul was not trusting in God enough to go out and kill this giant. How about us today? Are we offended by sin? Do we allow sin into our lives? You say, well, no, David, I don't. Well, are you sure? What about in the things that we watch on TV? The things that we read on Facebook? The websites that we visit online? The words that we say during the week that we think nobody else is around? Or when we're with those who are unchurched, when we're around those folks, how do we act? Does it bother you when you hear people curse, or do you just kindly accept it and go on? Does it bother you when you see people doing things that you know is an abomination to God? Or do you just accept it and go on and say, well, that's society today and that's the way things are? Or does that stuff bother you? Folks, I'm afraid so many times we've gotten so accustomed to seeing it on our televisions and on our phones and on our computers that we just kind of accept it. And we just allow it to come into our lives, and we begin to become accustomed to it. You know, and I've used this example before. Years ago, I remember when the word pregnant was said on the I Love Lucy show for the first time, and that caused the biggest stir on the networks because that word was used on public television. Oh, to be back to those days today. That was mild compared to what's on our televisions today. And folks, we've gotten used to it. We're no longer offended by sin. We just allow it to come in. We have to be offended by sin. Do you remember when King Jehoiakim cut up the scroll? They found the scroll and they were reading it, and he was cutting it up and putting it in the fire and burning it. Do you remember his servants and those that were around him? What's said about them? Jeremiah chapter 36, verse 24. Yet they were not afraid, nor did they tear their garments, the king nor any of his servants who heard these things. They read the scrolls, and Jehoiakim was cutting them up and burning them, and those of his servants that were around him didn't bother. They were fine with it. Have we gotten to that point? Have we gotten to the point to where sin, we've gotten so accustomed to sin that it no longer offends us? We see commercials on television that promote homosexuality, and we just think, oh, well, there it is. Folks, even in the commercials we see. Remember we talked about a while ago, Satan as a roaring lion walking around seeking whom he may devour? There he is, big as life, right there, on our television screens, and we just kind of accept it. Folks, we cannot accept that. We're told in Romans chapter 12 to abhor that which is evil. Abhor that which is evil. Why should we abhor evil? Why should we hate evil? Number one, evil cost the life of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Number two, evil can cause us to lose our soul and spend eternity in the devil's hell. So we need to make sure that we don't get to the point that we allow sin to become so, or that we don't become so accustomed to being around sin that we end up falling into sin. Remember the latter part of Romans chapter 1, we're told that not only those who practice such things, and then that list that's there in Romans chapter 1 of all the sins that are there, not only those who practice such things, but those who approve of those who practice them are just as guilty. We need to be careful what we watch, what we listen to, what we read, and what we look at on the internet. And can I suggest to you that if it's wrong to say it, it's wrong to write it. Because we're just getting accustomed to it. Now, let's say that we have become accustomed to sin. What lesson can we get from David? What do we need to do? Well, I think we need to refocus our attention. Refocus our attention on God's Word. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 28. And I want you to see the reaction here of David's older brother. And I want you to look at that reaction. Eliab was angry at David. Look in verse 28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he had spoken to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. What had David done that made him mad? David had criticized him a little bit, and said, hey folks, look around. Look who we are. We are God's people. And you're allowing this Philistine to defy you and defy God? David said, I can't believe it. And Eliab got angry about it. And not only did he get angry, but the other people that were around him were angry with David. Because David said, hey, I'll go take him on. I'm not afraid. God is with me. And what did David do? We read through the account. You know, remember Saul put his armor on David? And it was so big that David couldn't move. David says, I don't need this. God is with me. God has delivered the bear and the lion into my hand. Remember, that's what David was going on. The lion and the bear. I killed them. And David goes out and faces Goliath. We need to refocus. We need, no matter if it makes our neighbor angry, no matter if it makes our brother or sister angry, we need to refocus on God. That's what David did. David was focused on God, not on Goliath. He wasn't worried about Goliath because he was focused on God. And we can't allow others to rob us of our salvation. If we're in a group of people in our daily life that are not Christians, and they tell dirty jokes, they curse, and then we just fit right in. We laugh at those jokes and we join in with those cursings. And we just fit in and we don't stand out. We're not making a difference. We have to do what David did. Have the courage to stand up and say, hey, I'm not going to listen to that. If it requires walking away, then walk away. Face that giant. Be willing to step up and say, hey, I'm not going to listen to that. And folks, sometimes that takes courage. Remember what the church was told in Acts chapter 2, or in Romans chapter 2, verse 10? Some of you are going to be facing prison. Some of you are going to be facing death. Some of you are going to be facing very difficult times because you're Christians. But be faithful unto death. You be faithful, no matter what. Whether you have to walk away from your friends and find new friends, or whether you have to walk away from whatever it is, get up and turn off the television, turn off the computer, whatever you need to do, do it. So that we can have that crown of righteousness. So that we're not drawn away. David focused on God. Instead of being focused on these things, he refocused on God. And that's what you and I need to do. It may not be easy, but that's what we need to do. Do you remember what Job said in Job chapter 13, verse 15? Even though, in talking about God, Job said, even though he slay me, I will trust him. No matter what I have to do, I will trust God. And that's what you and I need to do. We need to trust God. Number 3, we need to remember. We need to remember. We need to go back in our lives and remember the blessings that God has given us. Have you ever heard of the providence of God? The providence of God. how God works in our life? You know, I can't tell you exactly how it works. I don't understand God that well. But I can tell you that it works. I cannot see it in the future, but I can look back in my life and see that the providence of God has been working. And I think you can as well. You know, I don't know what lies in store for me, but I see in my past God working, God providing, and God doing exactly what He said He would do and taking care of the things that I have needs of. David remembered that bear and that lion. And did David take credit for killing that bear and that lion? No. David said, God allowed me to do that. God gave me that courage. God gave me that strength because I trusted in Him. And David said, because I remember that, I know what God's done for me in the past, I can take care of this Philistine because God will be there with me and I can overcome it. Was David victorious over Goliath? Absolutely. Absolutely. Was David the only one that could have defeated Goliath? No, he wasn't. Had the others trusted in God like David did, God would have been there with them. But they didn't trust in God that much. You see, Saul even tried to put his armor on David, thinking it's something that he could do. Even had David had the armor and went and faced Goliath, unless God had been with him, chances would have been very slim that David would have defeated Goliath. But David was able to defeat Goliath because he remembered what God had done and he trusted in God. Remember again in Romans chapter 8, if God is for us, who can be against us? If God is for us, who can be against us? Who can overcome us? Who can defeat us? Even a Christian who loses their life for their belief, even if a Christian loses their life for their belief, they have not been defeated. You ever thought about that? All of those Christians in the first century who were put to death, they wasn't defeated. They were victorious. They won. Remember, the whole book of Revelation is written for us and for them to know that even though things look so bad, that if we have God on our side, we're going to win even if it costs us our life. We're going to win. We're going to be victorious. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that with God on our side, we are unbeatable. We are undefeatable. And we will be victorious. Number 4, we must always, without a doubt, trust in God. Trust God. No matter how dark things look, no matter how terrible things look, trust in God. Have that confidence, that assurance. David trusted God. Look in 1 Samuel, again, chapter 17, beginning about verse 45. You come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin. Now I want you to remember this, and I want you to get this image in your mind. This giant, over 9 foot tall, David, I don't know how tall he was. Say if it was my height, if I stand up beside somebody over 9 foot tall, all the armor and Goliath had a shield bearer going before him carrying his shield and his spear and his sword, all of the things that Goliath had. And David walking out to meet him. And look at what he said. You come to me, and this is Goliath, you come to me with a sword and a spear. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. David wasn't taking credit for it. He was trusting in God. He was knowing that God was going to allow him to win the battle. Paul says in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In other words, I can overcome whatever Satan throws at me. I can handle it if I have Christ in my life. David said, I can handle whatever comes my way if I have God in my life. And folks, so can you and I. Even things as bleak as death, we can overcome if we have God in our life. But we have to trust God. Remember again what Job said in chapter 13. Even though he slay me, even though I lose my life, I will trust him in talking to God. Because God offers us an eternity. God offers us an eternity in heaven with him. But how? What do you and I have to do in order to receive that reward of eternal bliss with God in heaven? Folks, it's very simple. We obey him. We do what God said. We can go back in the Old Testament, all the way through the Old Testament, and see example after example where people who obeyed God, who done what God said, received the reward. Those who didn't do what God said, they didn't receive the reward. So we have to trust in God. And we have to follow God, and we have to obey God. David's decision to trust in God allowed him to win. And again, folks, the same is true with you and I. No matter how bleak things look, no matter what you're facing in life, if we trust in God, it will all be okay. It'll be all right. Even though we lose our life, we will be better off. Do you remember what the Apostle Paul said? Paraphrasing, he says, I'm between a rock and a hard place. If it's up to me, I'd want to just go on and be with Christ. Because to be with Christ is far better for me. See the confidence? You see the trust? You and I can have that same assurance, that same trust. And remember, when you face difficulties in life, when you face struggles in life, when you face temptation in life, don't tell God how big your problems are. Tell your problems how big your God is. And you've heard that before. But that is so true. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can face whatever comes my way. I can face whatever troubles come my way if I have God on my side. James says if we resist the devil, he will flee from us. So it's up to us to resist. It's up to us to abstain from the very appearance of evil, to be offended by evil and by sin, and to remember what God has done for us, and to refocus our life when we get sidetracked and get back on track, and then we trust in God. This morning, if you're here and you've got a giant that you're facing, and you need to pray as your brothers and sisters in Christ, we will pray with you and pray for you. If you've allowed that problem to pull you down and draw you away from God, you can come back, and we'll pray with you and pray for you. And God will forgive you. But if you've never obeyed the gospel, you've never become a child of God, then that's something you need to prayerfully think about today. Do I want to have the confidence and trust in God that He will save my soul? Or do I want to go through life worried about what's going to happen to me after this life is over? If you have a desire to become a child of God, we can assist you with that. If you don't know what you need to do, if you don't understand that, you grab me or somebody in this audience this morning and ask them, and they will steer you in the right direction and show you what God's Word tells us that we need to do in order to become a Christian. We will help you with that. But more important than that, God will help you with that. So this morning, if you're subject to the invitation, we encourage you to come while we stand and while we sing.